as all the wonderful answers you gave. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Politics in the Pub. I am Chandran. I'll be chairing today's session at Politics in the Pub. Before I go any further, first and foremost, let me acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Now, today's topic is titled Assault on Australian History from the Right, Culture Wars. The second speaker is Noah Bassil. Now, Noah is no stranger to many of us, but nonetheless it is my duty to introduce him as the speaker.
Brief.
I will be brief. Dr. Noah Bassil is a senior lecturer in the Department of Modern History, Politics and International Relations in the Faculty of Arts at Macquarie University. He continues to hold a position with the Center for Middle East and North African Studies at Macquarie University. Now, his interests include global political economy, colonialism and post-colonialism, and political economy of uneven North-South relations. He has published on a range of topics, and most recently, he published a book titled The Post-Colonial State and Civil War in Sudan, The Origins of Conflict in Darfur, and that was published in 2012. He is currently researching into the global, regional, and national power relations that have emerged following the Arab uprisings. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Anna Clark and Noah Bassil in the usual way.
Thank you, everyone. I just want to premise this presentations talk with a couple, one conversation I had in Egypt about 3 or 4 years ago, where I was sitting in a bar in Cairo and I was talking to some sort of young students, university students, and one of the women said to me, the reason we fight over whether we can wear the headscarf or not, or whether women should be allowed to work in public spaces, is because they don't want us to talk about corruption, who gets the benefits of the assets of this state. And it made me start to think about culture and how it plays out and who controls it. And I've been meaning to write I've begun and I've started to work on a way of understanding culture as part of this dynamic of the Arab Spring and how it continues to resurface, even though protesters and others are consistently asking for changes to the economic system. They want a new way of doing business, so to speak. But continually, political leaders, the media, and others continue to go back to issues of gender, and religion, and so forth. So that's the sort of big project. I'd say it was late last year, and I've also got a Christopher Pine moment that sort of brings me to this topic. As we were preparing for this program, I started reading some of Christopher Pine's ideas for history and cultural revision here in Australia. And in one particular speech, he said that historians in Australia have focused too much on unions and collective action, and we've written nothing about the positive and huge contribution that business has made to this country. And he wanted to reorient historians towards the history of business and the progress that it has brought to this country. And that made me think about the way that the history wars or the culture wars would play out with a new government. And there were other issues as well that converged with that. We had George Brand just reminding us of our rights to be bigots and so forth, which all sort of suggested that we were going into a phase of a new culture or history wars. And we've seen that play out. I mean, I think the lead up to the budget was a good example of how there were certain ideas that were put forward and so forth. And I'll talk about that in more detail. I want to start the paper with just a quote from Ben Eltham. I don't know if anyone's read his work. He writes in New Matilda and elsewhere, largely about the culture wars. And he wrote a few months ago that the right understands that symbols are every bit as important as policy details, much more important, in fact. Now, I respect those on the left who continue to fight the culture wars in the face, I think, of what is quite a huge and very well-funded and resourced propaganda machine that the Conservatives have at their disposal. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of these sort of institutions and aspects of it a little bit later. But I think in many ways the right have lost the culture wars, despite the noise and clamour they make over issues as diverse as gay marriage, climate change and European invasion and conquest of Australia. But I think it's fair to say that the Conservative right controls economic ideology, that is, the way that we understand our economic identity or our identity in regards to the economy. For example, and this came up recently with in the aftermath of the budget, and I'll talk a little bit more about budget as well. And again, we've seen the sale of public assets, and privatisation, I think, is one such issue where there seems to be a really uncontested consensus, at least in the public sphere. Few people in the public space seem willing to even mount a challenge to the claim that the private sector is always more efficient, whatever the word efficient means, and successful than the public sector. This view survives despite numerous examples of public assets that have been sold to private investors with the promise of better and cheaper services, and that on just about every example I can think of, those promises have not been delivered on. Time doesn't allow me to go into the list here, but let me just say Qantas and Telstra and leave it at that. Another example of this sort of dominance, I think, or pervasive of these sort of economic notions or notions of economic identity is one that I think is becoming increasingly obvious to me, and maybe it's always been around, but I tend to notice it more and more in public debate, and certainly in reactions that people have to certain public, especially state activities. And this is the idea of the taxpayer. Once we were citizens, we were members of a community, we were Australians, whatever that means, and we can talk about that as well. But more and more often, I'm hearing people identify themselves as taxpayers. And I think that's also part of this sort of victory of the right in reshaping us all into economic animals or homo economicus. The recent explosion of public outrage just this week at the proposed expenditure of public funds for artworks in the City of Sydney, I'm sure you've all read or seen some of the debate, was couched more often than not. I mean, there were some valid criticisms, but there were many others that were couched in terms of what a waste of taxpayers, i.e. my money. And I heard that over and over again. I was driving home the other day, the day that the story broke, and I was listening to 702, which one would think is a more balanced audience, and I heard this over and over again, both from people ringing in and from the text that the radio host read out on air. Whenever I hear such arguments, I'm always reminded of Oscar Wilde's definition of a cynic, a person who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. It seems so many of us now are cynics, and how the left responds to this is part of the imperative of what I want to present tonight. So let me try and be clear about my argument. I'm not really sure I can be, because I'm not absolutely sure I know what it is, but I'm sure it'll come together. I think that the current culture wars are important. The legacy of European conquest and colonisation on Indigenous nations, anti-discrimination protections, the value of multiculturalism, and so on require our constant attention. But here I think, as I said earlier, I think the Conservatives are fighting a losing battle. Regardless of the huge efforts made by groups such as the Institute for Public Affairs, the Sydney Institute, the Australian Christian Lobby, Murdoch Press, and Macquarie Radio Network, and the huge corporate backing that many of these organisations have, they are largely on the outer on a whole range of cultural issues. They may be vocal, but on the whole they are at odds with public opinion on so many of the issues on which the culture wars are fought. This may be because the left fights the culture wars, but my sense is that it has more to do with the nature of the Conservative views on these issues and how outdated they are to most Australians. In some of the culture war debates, the Conservatives have won, and here I'm mainly referring to the refugee issue. But I think this has to do mostly with the deep historical racist tendencies of Australia towards non-Europeans, mostly Orientals, whether from Asia or farther afield. We still live in the shadow of the black peril, the yellow peril, and the fear of being overrun by coolies from the north. I'll come back to how we may use other aspects of Australian history to construct a more progressive counter-narrative, but for the moment, let me continue constructing my argument, and hopefully it will come together at some point. I believe the culture wars are fought on the wrong terrain. I guess that's where I'm coming at with what I've been talking about up to now, and that goes back to that conversation that I started with in Cairo 4 or 5 years ago. And I would add, on a terrain on which the Conservatives want us to fight and concentrate our attention. That is, we fight over issues such as gender, sexuality, history, and all the time, Conservatives continue to embed notions of privatisation, free markets, shrinking the role of government and the state, and pushing an economic model that enriches a few and impoverishes the rest. Here I'm reminded of a quote from Terry Eagleton. Some of you may know him. He's a scholar of English literature, but he's also a he's a well-regarded Marxist who continues to write on a whole range of issues from neoliberalism to many others, who argued that many scholars had retreated from challenging the exploitation caused by global capitalism, and instead decided to contest the way that people's cultural identities were framed. And in doing so, he argued that such approaches, as a quote from him, inflate the significance of culture in human affairs while marginalising issues that really matter in the production of misery, including the unjust consequences of certain trade regimes, militarisation, and the like. So here, and I don't think Eagleton tries to dismiss the need to contest the ground, this cultural ground, but instead, and with him in agreement, I think that we've overcompensated, and largely, I agree that we've sort of removed ourselves from the struggle over these sort of basic or these very important arguments about how we understand our economic identity or our relationship to the economy. And so I think we need to refocus the culture wars somewhat, and we need to reconstruct ourselves and reconstruct the way that we think about key issues and challenge notions of cost, benefit, efficiency, production, profit, etc., which continually, I think, pervade much of the way that people talk about a whole range of issues, from education right through to the family. And I was listening to, just on the way here, I was listening to discussions about paid parental leave, where people were only talking about it in terms of cost benefit. How would it get people back into employment? Not about the role of the family, nurturing, and all those things that also should, I think, be key considerations in terms of parental leave or parenting more generally. Now let me now say that I think we can start to see the emergence of a counter-narrative. So there is a positive to this, I think, to the dominant economic ideology of our time. And for this, and this is in Australia, I think we've seen gaps and the emergence of counter-narratives or counter-discourses in other places in Spain and elsewhere as a result of the impact of the GFC and quite serious recession and structural change in many countries, Greece, and I've been following similar debates in Egypt as well. But here in Australia, I think we can thank the ineptitude and arrogance of the Abbott government and their misplaced belief that the propaganda machine that they had at their disposal would allow them to control the narrative and convince Australians that healthcare and education, social security, and a range of other public goods are too costly, that expenditure in these areas are living beyond our means. The propaganda machine also ran a massive campaign, you'll remember it, it's still being run, that such things, social welfare, social goods, are entitlements, and that we now live in an age after entitlement. But the reason that most Australians, or one of the reasons I think that most Australians oppose the budget isn't, the reasons go beyond just some of the material or negative financial impacts on them. Many decisions taken over the last 30 years by successive federal and state governments, both sides of the political spectrum, if you believe there is a political spectrum these days, have had far more telling financial impact on people than even this latest raft of user pay policies and cut to services, and yet they don't seem to have created the same outrage. So there's got to be some other reason. Now, part of this reason lies with our history. So I'm going to try and integrate my cultural thing with a bit of historical analysis. Don't hold me too strongly to this, because I am a very amateur historian. But here I mean the historical narratives that Australians have constructed to define themselves, which, despite 30 years of neoliberalism and what I'll call attempted Americanisation, lingers in the same way that white Australia policy does. And what I'm talking about here is that part of our historical narrative that is built on widely held ideas that Australia is fair and egalitarian. Yes, they may be myths, but nonetheless they continue to hold truck, and the response to the budget showed this, as did the widespread anger over Howard's work choices legislation in the preceding decade. So I guess what I'm getting at is that in this space, with this knowledge of history and this sort of understanding of this historical mythology, if you want to call it that, we may be able to mount, and we must mount, I argue, a challenge to the prevailing economic ideas that have replaced our sense of collective social and human identities with those of egotism and consumerism. Now, these historical myths were also intrinsic to the narrative of neoliberalism. This is one of, I guess, the contradictions that I've also picked up on here. That is this notion that neoliberalism, and I've been looking at some of the earlier discussions about privatisation and deregulation here in Australia. I'm not completely sold on this, but I think there is a sense that part of the way that Australians reconciled themselves to these changes was on the basis that whilst there may have been unfair outcomes from neoliberalism or from this restructuring, there was still some fairness and opportunity built into the system. I think the authors of the budget failed to understand that Australians accept or have reconciled themselves to the inequality of the outcomes, as I suggested, only because there is a sense or a belief that we have a system that sustains equality of opportunity. I think this has come through in successive government policies and discourse, and I think that's why we've seen such a hostile reaction to changes to education, because education is seen as one area where people can have fairness and opportunity regardless of the outcomes down the line. I think in this way fairness remains a part of our sense of ourselves. What the budget did was remove this, or rather attempted to reconstruct fair in a different way. And the response that followed, or continues to follow, illustrates how embedded Australians are to our sense of fairness. So what the culture war shows, and I'll wrap up with this, is that the conservative right cannot just change cultural norms, regardless of how many shock jocks, right-wing newspaper columnists, or independent think tanks they have at their disposal. And I'm a bit disappointed that none of them are here, because I would like them to get that message. Yeah, maybe they are. They certainly can influence and shape our cultural norms, but something deeper and more complex than just propaganda shapes culture. Culture is indeed complex. It is historical, it is codependent on material structures, it is, here in Australia, I think there's a certain humanist thread, and it's in this knowledge of all this that we should go forward into the culture wars once more. Thank you.